So let's talk about the movements of the different parts of the body first before we get into the anatomy, and we'll review these when we get into each segment as well. So first, with the shoulder, we've got a few main movements here. The first one is going to be flexion, taking the arms in front of us overhead. Extension is going to be moving the arms behind us. Abduction is going to be taking the arms out, versus adduction or adduction, which is going to be adding the arms back in toward the midline. So abduction takes them away, adduction adds them back in toward the body. Then we've got internal rotation and external rotation, which would be the same here, internal rotation and external rotation. And then we have all sorts of different combinations of all of those. So flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, and external rotation. Now for the scapula, we have a few different movements, and there actually are several more, but these are going to be the main movements that we're going to look at here. We have the elevation of the scapula and depression of the scapula. So again, we're thinking of the shoulder blades lifting and lowering. Then we have protraction and retraction, meaning that the scapula are drawing apart into protraction, and retraction is where the scapula are drawing together. Then the last one, and you've got this in your manual as well, the easiest way to think of this one, this is called upward and downward rotation. And this is relative, it's easiest to think about this in relationship to the glenoid fossa. So think about this glenoid fossa again like a cup. As I upwardly rotate it, it's going to hold the contents of that cup. And his doesn't move here, so it won't really show it very well. But as the scapula rotates upward, the cup of the glenoid fossa is going to start to turn up. As it rotates downward, it's going to turn back down toward the floor. So I have retraction, protraction, elevation, depression, upward and downward rotation. And that picture in your manual actually gives a nice picture of that. In the forearm, what we're going to look at is pronation and supination. And in fact, we won't really talk a lot about the forearm in particular because things get a little bit more complex and complicated as we get down into some of the finer muscles of the forearm and the hand. But two main movements here we're looking at is going to be pronation and supination. And the easiest way to remember this is thinking about lying supine or on your spine in Shavasana. The supinated variation of the forearms turns me supine into Shavasana versus pronating here. Then the next one we're going to look at is the hip. Now the hip is going to be similar to the shoulder in that we're going to have flexion and extension. Just like the shoulder, we've got flexion and extension. We also have abduction and adduction, so abduction and adduction, adding it back in toward the midline. And then we have external and internal rotation, right? So the shoulders and the hips are going to be the same range of motion there. In the ankle, we have inversion and eversion. And we have plantar flexion, which is going to be pointing, and dorsiflexion, which is drawing the toes back. Now, we mentioned this already briefly in the spine, but in the spine, we have flexion and extension. We have right and left rotation and right and left lateral flexion. And some texts talk about this last motion of axial extension, which is oftentimes what we talk about in yoga is this lengthening of the midline. Lastly, when we look at the pelvis, we have two main movements here, which is going to be the anterior tilting of the pelvis and the posterior tilting of the pelvis. And again, the easiest way to remember this is to think of the pelvis like a bowl. As I anteriorly tilt the pelvis, I'm spilling the contents of the bowl out in front of me. And as I posteriorly tilt, I'm containing or holding on to the contents of the bowl of the pelvis. So there's your breakdown of the main movements of the body. Next time we meet, we'll be chatting on anatomy.